She walked in alone, dressed plainly. Soft cardigan, white shirt, sneakers barely scuffed. Her eyes were calm, her presence unshaken, even as the glittering chandeliers above cast a cold spotlight on her entrance. In a dining room dressed in tuxedos and pearls, she moved like someone used to being watched but never truly seen. Whispers followed her like shadows. Judging eyes traced her every step, and by the time the hostess called over security to escort her out, the room fell into a hush. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't broken any rule. But still, they watched as she was gently but firmly walked through a sea of linen and glassware, like a disruption, not a guest. They saw her sneakers, not her story, her skin, not her status. But 3 minutes later, the sound of a Porsche engine rolled in like thunder across marble, and every head turned. The man who stepped out didn't ask for a reservation. He asked for his wife. Before we begin, tell us, have you ever been misjudged before anyone asked your name? Naomi Carter moved with the kind of grace that didn't ask to be noticed. At 29, she had lived lifetimes behind her eyes, first as a social worker, then as a woman who chose peace over prestige. She wore no makeup, let her natural curls fall freely, and dressed in soft, neutral tones that spoke of quiet comfort, rather than wealth. Her hands were calloused not from softness but from service. She had built her life around helping others until burnout made her retreat inward, focusing now on healing in stillness rather than chaos. But today wasn't about her. Today, she had walked into an upscale, chandelier-lit restaurant, an institution, of old money and whispered power plays. Not for herself, but for someone she loved deeply. She was there to finalize a surprise dinner reservation for her husband, Marcus Carter's birthday. What no one around her knew, what the pearls and cufflinks at every table failed to guess, was that Naomi was married to one of the most powerful men in clean energy. Marcus Carter, 42, billionaire, visionary, yet humble to the bone. He could own rooms without saying a word, but the only person he ever bowed to was Naomi. Their love was quiet and fierce, built on shared values, not Instagram optics. Marcus often said Naomi saved his life, long before his money ever could. And today, Naomi wanted to give him something small and beautiful. A birthday dinner in the very place she knew he loved as a boy, back when he thought fine dining was the height of dreams. But dreams don't always welcome everyone. As Naomi stepped further into the opulent dining room, under chandeliers that dripped like icicles and walls lined with mirrors designed to reflect power back at itself, she felt it. The shift. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. Whispers floated like perfume. The patrons were dressed in sharp tuxedos and silk gowns, but their eyes were sharpest of all. And behind the front desk stood Ingrid, the floor manager, polished and severe, with a clipboard tucked under her elbow like a weapon. Ingrid's eyes skimmed Naomi from top to bottom, lingering on her sneakers, her cardigan, her bare face. She offered a smile that was anything but warm. Naomi met it with calm, unfazed, but the room had already decided. She didn't belong here. Still, Naomi stood tall. She was not there to prove herself. She was there for Marcus, and she had no idea that by the end of the evening it would not be her who had something to prove. It would be every person in that room who looked past her like she was invisible. Naomi approached the host stand with the same composure she had carried through far greater trials than this. She offered a gentle smile, her voice calm as she said, "Hi, I'd like to confirm a dinner reservation for this evening. It's a surprise for my husband's birthday." She mentioned his name, Marcus Carter, with quiet pride, not expecting recognition, only clarity. But the woman behind the podium, Ingrid, barely glanced at the list before looking Naomi up and down with a tight-lipped smirk. Her eyes paused on the simple cardigan, the leggings, the worn sneakers. "I'm sorry," Ingrid said, voice coated in icy professionalism, "but we have a strict dress code." Her tone wasn't about policy. It was about dismissal. Naomi's smile didn't falter. She nodded slowly, her hands folded in front of her. "I understand. I'm not dining today. Just here to speak with the manager about the reservation." Her voice was polite, measured, never rising to match the room's judgment. But Ingrid wasn't listening. She was performing for the patrons now watching from behind their wine glasses and buttered bread, their heads turning like slow-moving spotlights. Without warning, Ingrid tilted her head and motioned discreetly to someone off to the side. Two security staff emerged moments later, walking with forced casualness. One leaned in. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step outside with us." Naomi blinked, confused for a split second. "Excuse me? Please," the other interrupted, voice low but firm. "Let's not make this difficult." Naomi froze, the sting of humiliation rising behind her eyes. But she didn't argue. She didn't shout. She straightened, gave a small nod, and walked calmly between them. As they led her past rows of tuxedoed diners and crystal glasses filled with vintage wine, the clinking stopped. Conversations quieted. A few guests chuckled into their napkins. Most just stared. Naomi walked with her head held high, but every step felt like a verdict passed without trial. The message was clear. You don't belong here. She walked out without resistance, but with a silence that pressed against every wine glass, every mirrored wall, every chandelier casting judgment from above. And then, the sound. Just as she stepped out onto the marble entrance, her shoes meeting the polished stone, the silence was broken by the low, thunderous purr of an approaching engine. A sleek Porsche rolled up, the sunlight glinting off its obsidian paint. The doors parted, and all heads, inside and out, turned toward the noise. Naomi's eyes flickered toward the driver's seat, breath catching not from fear, but from the shift that was about to come. Because the man who stepped out of that Porsche wasn't just her husband. He was the man who would change the entire energy of the room with nothing more than a look. The Porsche Taycan glided to a stop like it belonged to another world. Its glossy black frame shimmered beneath the late afternoon light, and as the door lifted, Marcus Carter stepped out, 6'2" in a tailored black suit, presence undeniable. He didn't carry the kind of power that asked for attention. It announced itself with the silence that followed him. His eyes found Naomi immediately, standing there with her hands loosely clasped, posture straight but shoulders trembling ever so slightly. He walked quickly toward her, concern already knitting his brow. "Naomi," he said, voice low, warm, protective. "What's going on?" She didn't speak at first, just shook her head lightly, her eyes scanning the windows where diners still watched from behind chandeliers and cold stares. "They said I wasn't dressed properly," she finally whispered, her voice clipped with restrained emotion. "Didn't let me speak to anyone. They escorted me out." The words hung between them, quiet and cutting, For a moment, Marcus simply stared at her, absorbing every ounce of insult she carried so gracefully. Then his jaw tightened. His eyes, usually soft around her, steeled with a quiet fury. Without a word, he turned and walked straight through the grand glass doors into the restaurant, his pace slow, deliberate. The maitre d', a young man in gloves and nerves, stumbled forward, eyes widening with recognition, but Marcus didn't stop. He scanned the room like a man who had once built it brick by brick. Ingrid appeared quickly, the practiced smile stretched across her lips, still unaware of the storm heading straight for her. "Sir, I believe there's been some confusion. If you'll allow me—" "There's no confusion." Marcus cut her off, his tone razor-sharp. "You turned away. Your founder's wife." The words didn't need to be loud. They didn't need to echo. But they did. All around the room, forks froze in midair. Wine glasses trembled slightly on their stems. Ingrid blinked. I wasn't aware." "No," Marcus said, eyes locked on hers. "You weren't. Because you looked at her sneakers instead of her strength. You heard her voice and judged her volume, not her value." He stepped closer, just enough to make Ingrid take a slight step back, her clipboard faltering in her grip. "You didn't ask who she was. You just assumed she wasn't worth knowing." Ingrid tried to recover, her words tripping over themselves. "Mr. Carter, we pride ourselves on standards." He laughed once, mirthless. "Your decor is elegant, but your manners are cheap." Then he turned toward the dining room, now completely silent. "For those of you enjoying your filet and Bordeaux, this establishment was built with my funding, and the woman you just watched be humiliated was the reason I ever had a reason to build anything at all." He let the truth settle, a thick, an echoing silence folding over every crisp tablecloth and chandelier sparkle. He turned back to Ingrid, whose hands now shook at her sides. "Refund every table. Shut it down for the night. And tell the board I'll be reviewing every single face representing this place, starting with yours." Then, with no further drama, Marcus turned, walked back out the same doors his wife had been pushed through minutes earlier, and held out his hand. Naomi, stunned but composed, slipped her hand into his without a word, and together they left. Not because they were unwelcome, but because some rooms weren't worthy of who they were. As the front doors slowly closed behind them, the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air like dust in sunlight. But Marcus wasn't finished. He turned back to the stunned crowd, standing now at the entrance with Naomi's hand still in his. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It carried because it was built from truth, not volume. "You want to know who she is?" he said, scanning the room of polished cutlery and stiff collars. "This woman sat with me when I couldn't speak. When my sister died and I nearly collapsed under the weight of grief, she sat in a small community office and listened until I found the strength to breathe again." The murmurs rippled through the room. Some leaned in. Others bowed there, heads slightly, guilt creeping in now that the full picture began to take shape. Marcus looked down at Naomi with a softness that cracked through his commanding edge. She was never flashy. She never needed the spotlight. That's why I married her quietly, away from headlines and cameras. I wanted to protect the one person who had nothing to prove to anyone, but everything to give. He turned back to the diners, his voice now softer, yet impossibly heavier. "She taught me how to live again. And today, you couldn't even offer her a chair." Ingrid stood frozen, her clipboard now lowered, her throat tightening with every word. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The diners, many of whom had looked at Naomi with judgment just moments ago, now exchanged glances filled with discomfort. Some whispered apologies under their breath. Too little, too late. Marcus looked back at Naomi, the Porsche still humming quietly at the curb. "We can still go in, if you want," he offered gently. "The table's yours." But Naomi, steady and composed, shook her head with a smile that carried both clarity and quiet power. "No," she said softly. "Some rooms don't deserve our presence." And just like that, she turned away. Not in anger, not in bitterness, but in quiet triumph. Because sometimes the greatest statement isn't made through confrontation, but through absence. The kind of absence that leaves a room empty, no matter how full the tables are. Naomi and Marcus left the restaurant hand in hand, the late sunlight catching the soft shimmer of her curls and the quiet fire in her eyes. Behind them, the doors of the so-called elite dining room closed, not with authority, but with shame. The whispers inside had turned from judgment to disbelief, and within days, the fallout came quickly. A board meeting was held. The investors were informed. The truth, captured on phones by a few bold patrons, spread across the internet like wildfire. Headlines read, "Billionaire's wife kicked out of restaurant before Porsche arrival shocks." Staff, and she didn't raise her voice, but she silenced the room. The board didn't hesitate. Ingrid was removed from her position with a quiet statement, and the restaurant released a carefully worded apology. But the damage had already rippled far beyond their walls. Naomi, ever composed, never responded, publicly. She didn't need to. Her grace had already spoken for her. But the moment had ignited something bigger. A quiet wave of admiration grew online. Young women, especially women of color, saw themselves in her walk, her calm, her refusal to bend. She became a symbol, not of luxury, but of self-worth. And Marcus, moved by what the world had finally seen in his wife, took action in his own way. 6 months later, a new restaurant opened downtown. It wasn't opulent for the sake of being exclusive. It was elegant in its openness, warm in its design, beautiful because it welcomed every walk of life. The name above the door read, Naomi's Table. Inside, the staff wore what made them comfortable. The hostess greeted guests with genuine warmth, not suspicion. The kitchen was run by women of color who had long been passed over in high-end culinary spaces. The restaurant didn't just serve food, it served dignity. Naomi, though, found her heart still in the community. She returned to her roots, launching mentorship programs for young girls in underserved neighborhoods. She sat in circle groups, in school gyms and libraries, surrounded by wide eyes and eager questions. And one afternoon, standing in the very community center where she had first worked as a social worker, she spoke softly to a group of teenagers watching her with reverence. "Don't shrink to be accepted," she said. "Let the room adjust to you." They listened, not because she was famous now, not because she was married to a billionaire, but because she carried truth, and they felt it. One girl asked her what she did when people underestimated her. Naomi smiled. "I don't correct them. I just let them watch." Later that evening, she and Marcus returned to Naomi's table for dinner. They sat at a quiet booth in the corner. She wore the same sneakers, the same soft cardigan. And as she looked around at a room filled with warmth, color, and laughter, Marcus leaned in and whispered, This is the restaurant you deserved that day." Naomi looked at him, eyes filled with gratitude and purpose. "No," she replied. "This is the one I was meant to build." She didn't wear power. She carried it in her stillness. They kicked her out for not looking wealthy. They didn't realize she married the kind of man who builds the world she walks on. Naomi never needed to raise her voice or flash a diamond to be heard. Her silence spoke in full sentences. Her stillness carried the weight of generations who'd learned to endure with grace. She didn't need to prove herself to anyone. Not that day, not ever. And when the world finally looked closer, it realized the woman they dismissed was the very heartbeat of the man they admired. In the end, the room that rejected her became the lesson, and the world that watched learned that worth isn't stitched into fabric. It's woven into how you carry yourself when no one's clapping. Have you ever been judged by your appearance and later proved them wrong? If Naomi's quiet strength moved you, share this story with someone who knows their worth. And tell us, what does real dignity mean to you? Thanks for watching. Join us again for more stories where grace walks quietly, but never leaves unnoticed.